Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be creating the pet hatching system. As always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified whenever I upload more Roblox fun content. I also have Patreon. If you guys like to support me and get access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode, there's a link down below in the description, and you guys go and check that out. With that being said, let's hop right into it. Before we hop into studio, you guys are going to want to go down below in the description and click on the link that takes you to this Patreon post right here. Now, this Patreon post is completely free, and everybody can access it without even making a Patreon account. So you guys are going to go to that link and download the assets.zip file. Inside of that file is a ton of Roblox models that you can drag and drop directly into Studio. The reason for this is because we are going to be using the egg stand model today. Now, hopping directly into Studio, if you guys have been following along with this entire series, you should actually have this model set up on both your Arctic and your volcano island as well. Now, since the episodes where we added this, we've actually made changes to the egg stand model, so we are going to want to replace these two. So I'm going to add the new model directly into our workspace. Let's go ahead and look at it, and we can see it right here. Now, the most important part of this model, if for instance you wanted to create your own egg stand model, would be that you have a model right here, and inside of the model there should be something called price. Now, as we can see when we click on that, this object is highlighted right here, and then if we go ahead and expand that out, we can actually see that there are two meshes inside of here. So there's that mesh, and then there's like a white light right behind here as well. Additionally, there's a part, which when we click on that, we can move it around, and we can see that it's basically the price display part right here. That's why it's called price. Now, inside of this part, we have a surface GUI, and inside of that surface GUI, we have an image label and a text label as well. The image label is called icon, and we'll be replacing this image with the actual currency, such as Robux or clicks, depending on what currency this egg actually takes. And then the text of the text price label will, of course, be replaced with how much the egg actually costs to purchase. So this service GUI and this part inside of your model is basically the most important part, because that's the only part that our scripts are really going to be interacting with. Additionally, we want to make sure that the primary part property of the egg stand is set to something as well. Now, for our model, we actually have the primary part set as the stand part right here, because this is basically the size of the entire model. So as long as you have that property set, you should be good to go. Additionally, if you look towards the bottom of our properties, I also have an attribute set on this, and the attribute is called egg, and the value of this attribute is basic. Now, how our egg stands are going to work is basically every single egg stand is going to have an attribute on it. The attribute is going to be called egg, and then the value of that attribute is going to be whatever the egg is actually called. So in this example, this egg is actually going to be the basic egg, and then I'll show you exactly what I mean when we create a couple more eggs. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and move this model over towards our spawn area right here. So right here, we are going to add the basic egg. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control D on this to duplicate this and move it over a little bit. Now that we've duplicated this egg stand, we're not going to rename the model or anything. We're going to go down to the attributes, and for this egg, I want to set the egg attribute to Earth. So we now have a basic egg and an Earth egg. Let's go ahead and duplicate this and move this inside of the Arctic folder. And then of course, let's drag this all the way up to there. So now that we have it up here, I'm going to rotate that around. And now for the egg, I'm going to say Arctic. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete this other egg stand that we have right there. I'm then going to duplicate this and drag it up to volcano right up here. And then let's go ahead and put this inside of the volcano folder, delete the other egg stand, reposition this a little bit better. So there we go. And then let's set the egg attribute to volcano. Okay, we now have 4 egg stands in our game. They're all set up and they all have the attribute set up on them correctly. Now that our eggs are set up on our map, let's go ahead and actually create the GUI. So I'm going to close my workspace, go into the start GUI, and add a brand new screen GUI to this. We're then going to rename this to pet egg. And then inside of here, we're going to add a billboard GUI, and we're going to rename this to egg. Now for the properties of the screen GUI, we actually want to make sure that we have reset on spawn set to false. Additionally, for the billboard GUI, we want to make sure that we have always on top set to true. I'm going to set my max distance to about 30. We're going to set reset on spawn to false. For the size, we're going to go with a 15, 0, 15, 0. So 15 by 15 scaled. And then additionally, let's go into our workspace, and then we can click on the adorning property, and then we want to set it to this model right here. Now that we've set the adorning property, we can go into this GUI and add a frame to this. And now we can actually see the frame appears right there. Let's go ahead and set the size to be the full height and width of the GUI so that we can actually see how big it is and what it looks like and everything else like that. So now that we actually see our billboard GUI, we can actually start creating this. Now I'm going to set the background color of this frame to be a gray, and we're only going to keep this frame around so that we can actually see how large our square is. Because without a frame, it's just completely invisible, so this makes it a lot easier to create the GUI. Anyways, we're going to go ahead, duplicate this frame. For the background, we're going to set that to a white. For the size, we're going to set that to 0.5 scaled on both the X and the Y, and then we want to center this as well. So let's set the anchor point to 0.5 and the position to 0.5 on both X and the Y. Let's then throw a UI corner inside of here, and we're going to set the corner radius to 0.02. 0.25. Then we also want to throw a UI stroke inside of here as well. For the color, we want to make this a light blue, so something like that. And then for the thickness, we're going to set that to a 3. We're also going to throw a UI grid layout inside of here as well. And then we'll also add a text button here. We're going to rename this text button to template. On the UI grid list layout, for the cell size, we actually want to set that to 0.3 scaled on both the X and the Y. Let's go ahead and duplicate the template so that we can see what this looks like, and that looks pretty good. So for the cell padding, I'm going to set that to 0.03 on both the X and the Y scale as well. We're then going to throw a UI padding inside of the container as well. Now for the UI padding on the left, I'm going to set this to 0.019. So now we have a little bit of spacing between the border and the templates on the left side. And then for the top, I'm going to set that to 0.02. Now I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and duplicate 3 more templates. So now we can see how this would look when it's completely filled up. And that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete all of our extra templates, just leaving 1. For the template, we want to set the background color of this to a gray. So something like that. For the text, we're going to set that to blank because we don't want there to be any text. We're going to throw a UI corner inside of the template. So I'm just going to duplicate the one that we already have and drag that into there. I'm going to set the corner radius to 0.1. We're then going to throw a text label inside of this template. We're going to rename this to chance. For the text, we're going to say 50%. For the text color, we want that to be white. We're going to set the background transparency to 1. For the font, we're going to go with a Gotham. We're going to make that bold. And then for the stroke, we're going to set that to about a 0.5, maybe a little bit more if you want to do that. We also want to make sure that the text is scaled. Now for the size of this, on the X, we're going to set that to 1 because we want it to be the entire width. For the height, we're going to set that to 0.2, just like that. Now we might want to move this down just a tiny bit. So for the position, I'm going to say 0.005, and I think that looks good. We can then duplicate this, and we're going to rename this to rarity. For the position of this, we can set this to 0.8. For the text, we're going to say common, and I think that looks good. We're then going to duplicate this one more time. For the text, we're going to say X. For the text color, we're going to make that a red. For the stroke transparency, we're going to set that to 1. For the size, we're going to set this to 0.8 on both the X and the Y. And then we want to center this as well. There we go. We now have a big X right there, and we're going to rename this to selected. The reason that we're adding this is because anytime a player clicks on the pet inside of this GUI, they can of course set that pet to be automatically deleted, and this is how we're displaying if the pet is selected to be automatically deleted. Next, what we're going to do is throw a viewport frame inside of the template. For the sizes, we're going to set that to 0.75 on both the X and the Y. We also want to center this as well, just like that. Now, depending on how you look at this, you might not like this setup. We can currently see that the viewport frame is overlapping all of the text labels right here. I think what I would rather is for the text labels to actually overlap the viewport frame. And then specifically, I want this selected text label to definitely overlap everything else. So I don't really need to change the Z index because it's not overlapping either of the other text labels, but it would make sense to do this in most circumstances. Now, we also want to set the background transparency of the viewport frame to 1. So there we go. And now we're pretty much good with the template. So let's go ahead, duplicate that a couple of times and see how that looks. And it looks pretty good. So I'm going to delete all those extra templates, set the visibility of this to false, and then we're pretty much done with the container. Next, what we're going to do is duplicate the container and rename this to tip. For the size of this, we're going to set it to 0.175 on the X and 0.2 on the Y. Then for the position, we're going to set the anchor point to 0. And then on the X, we want to set that to 0.8 and 0.25 on the Y. So we want it to appear just a little bit to the right of our container frame. Now, inside of this frame, we actually don't really need anything, but we're going to take one of these text labels, put that inside of there. We're going to delete the template. We're going to delete the UI padding and the UI grid layout. Now for the text, we kind of picked the worst text label, but that's fine. The text color, we want to set that to black. For the text, we actually want to say click on any pet to the left to auto delete it. Exclamation mark. And there we go. We've got our text. Now we could increase the size of this if you wanted to. You could set it to like 0.95 or 0.9 or anything else like that. I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to actually set this to 0.9 instead. So I think that looks good. Then what we're going to do is duplicate the tip frame. We're going to rename this to info. For the size of this frame, we're going to set this to 0.2 on the X and 0.15 on the Y. And for the position, we want this to be to the left of the container and centered vertically. So on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.025. And then on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.5. And then for the anchor point Y, we're also going to set that to 0.5 as well. Now inside of this info frame, we can pretty much delete everything inside of here. We're then going to create a brand new frame and we're going to rename this to egg. Now for the background color, we also want that to be a blue. For the size, we're going to set this to 0.9 on the X and 0.4 on the Y. We're then going to throw a UI list layout inside of here. For the UI list layout, we want to make sure that we have the horizontal line center, and then we could also center them vertically as well. So that works. Inside of the egg frame, we're going to add a UI corner to this. For the corner radius, we're going to set that to 0.1. Then we're going to go inside of the tip frame and we're going to grab the text label, and then we're going to throw that inside of the egg frame and rename this to egg. Now for the text, we're going to say basic egg. For the text color, we actually want that to be a white. And now that looks pretty good. So what we can then do is duplicate this frame and then we can rename this to price. Now inside of this, we want to rename the egg text label to price. We also want to readjust the size of this as well. So on the X, we're going to set that to 0.75. Additionally, for the position on the anchor point, we're going to set the X to 0. And for the X scaled on the position, we're going to set that to 0.225. So it appears on the right part of the frame. Then we're going to throw an image label inside of here. We're going to rename this to icon. For the size of this, we're going to set it to 0.2 on the the X and 0.8 on the Y. And then we want to make sure that we center it vertically. So we're going to set that to 0.5 on the anchor point and position Y. And now I think that looks pretty good, but we might want to move it just a tiny bit over from the left. So we're going to say 0.01. And now I think that looks pretty good. And I think that looks pretty good. We also want to make sure that we set the scale type of the image to fit. And now if we want to actually set the image of this, let's go ahead inside of our asset manager, look at our images. We can go ahead and grab the clicks currency icon, copy to clipboard, set the image of this just like that. That looks pretty good. Let's make sure we set the background transparency to 1. And now we can see what it looks like. And that looks pretty good. Let's also adjust the text of the price label to be like 1000 so that we can see what that displays. And now that's looking pretty good. Now that we're done with the info frame, let's go ahead and set the background transparency of that to 1. One last thing, we can add a little bit of padding to the UI list layout, so maybe 0.05. And I think that padding is pretty good. Let's then go ahead and duplicate the tip frame. We'll rename this to buttons. For the size, we're going to go with 0.65 on the X and 0.15 on the Y. We want to center this horizontally and we want to position it directly below the container. So we're going to set the Y to 0.8. And that looks pretty good. Now, inside of this frame, we actually don't need any of the stuff inside of here. Instead, we're going to throw a UI grid layout inside of there. And then we're also going to throw a text button inside of here as well. We'll rename this text button to auto. Now, for the UI grid layout, the size, we're going to set that to 0.2 on the X and 0.8 on the Y. We also want to set the horizontal alignment to center as well as the vertical alignment. And for the vertical alignment, we actually want to set that to bottom. Now, let's go ahead and duplicate the text buttons a couple of times. And now we can adjust the cell padding. I'm going to set this to 0.04 on the X. And that padding looks pretty good to me. We'll then delete all of our extra buttons. Now, I made a slight mistake. Instead of using a text button, we're going to actually use an image button. So let's go ahead and set the name of this to auto. For the image, we're going to set that to blank. Inside of this button, we're going to throw a UI corner and a UI stroke into it. Now for the color of the UI stroke, we of course want to use our normal stroke blue, and then we're going to set that to 3. For the UI corner, we're going to set this to 0.1 for right now. Then we're going to go into tip, grab this text label, and throw that inside of the auto button. For the text of this, we want to say T. We're going to rename this text label to key. For the text color, we want to go with the same blue as the stroke. We're then going to duplicate that text label, and we're going to rename this to label. As I'm going through and editing this video, it seems like there is actually an error in the recording, and for some reason parts of the video weren't included. So I'm kind of re-recording this part, continued from where we left off last at. If your GUI looks any different than mine currently, kind of ignore those different aspects of it and continue following along with what we're doing right now. So what we're going to do next is we're going to duplicate the text label called key, and we're going to rename this to title. Now for the text of this, we're actually going to call this auto. The text color should actually be a white, and using the text stroke property, we want to make sure that we set the text stroke color 3 to the common stroke that we've been using this entire time, and make sure your text stroke transparency is set to 0. After that, we'll adjust its sizing. So on the X, we're actually going to set that to 1, and on the Y, we're going to set that to 0.2. Then we want to position this above the button. So to do that, for the anchor point on the Y, we're going to set that to 0. And for the position, we're actually going to set this to -0.3 on the Y, just like that. And now we can see that this text label is appearing above our button. So now we're pretty much done with that button. What we'll do is we'll duplicate this and we'll rename this to 3. Now inside of here, for the key, we're going to set the text of the key to actually say R. For the text of the title, we're going to say open 3. Then we'll duplicate this text button. We'll rename this to 1. For the text of the key label, we're going to say E. And for the text of the title label, we're going to say open 1. Then we're going to duplicate this one more time. We're going to rename this to 6. For the key text label, we're going to say F. And for the title text label, we're going to say open 6. Now that we've done that, what we can then do is set the background transparency of the buttons frame to 1 so that we no longer have that background. And now that's looking pretty good. We've now created all of our buttons. We have the info about the egg itself, such as the price and what egg it is. We also have the container where all the pets are going to be shown. And we also have the tip frame right there as well. We can then go ahead and delete the frame that we have right there. So now we no longer see the background. Now that we have the GUI created, let's go ahead and actually create the config file. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and create a brand new module script. We're going to rename this module script to eggs, and then we're also going to rename the variable inside of here to eggs as well. Towards the top of our script, we actually want to create a variable for the workspace, and we're going to get that service real fast. Then above our eggs variable, let's actually create a variable called config, and that's going to be equal to a table. Now, how our config is going to be set up is inside of this table, we're going to have the name of the egg. So for example, we have the basic egg, and that's going to be equal to another table. Now this table is going to have 3 different properties. The first property is going to be called price, and this is going to be how much the egg actually costs. The next property is going to be called currency, and this is actually going to be equal to a string. Now, our options here are going to be either clicks, rebirths, or Robux. So for instance, if we want to set the price of an egg to actually cost Robux instead of clicks, we could set this to Robux. Otherwise, we're going to set this to clicks. And now there's one more property, which is actually going to be called pet, and that's going to be equal to another table. Now, inside of this pets table is actually where we can start listing out all of our different pets that the egg is going to actually contain inside of it. So for instance, we're going to start off with the egg pet. That's going to be equal to a new table. Now, for the properties of this table, the first one is going to be chance, and we're going to set that to 40. Now, that means that this cat actually has a 40% chance of being selected. The next property is going to be called rarity, and we're going to set that equal to common. So now we know for each of the pets, we can set the chance that it has to catch from that egg, and then we can also set its rarity as well. So we're going to add 2 more pets to this. We're going to say dog, the chance of that is going to be 20. That's also going to be of the common rarity. And then we're going to add one more pet, which is going to be called Bunny. That's going to have a 5% chance, and that's going to be of the rare rarity. Now, if we look at that, we've pretty much completed our first egg. So what we're going to do is throw a comma at the end of this table, and then we're going to copy and paste it. Our next egg is actually going to be called Earth. Let's go ahead and change the price to be 99,000. For the currency, we're going to say Robux. For the pets, we can just give these guys different chances. So we could say like 60, 50, 20, and then we could also change the rarity as well. I don't really care to change that though. I'm just changing this stuff so that we can see while we're testing this out what it looks like. Obviously, when you're creating your own eggs, you want to make sure that you balance them out and select the different pets that you want to do. I'm just trying to make sure that we have all the eggs down here so that we can continue creating the system and see what it looks like in game. So our last two eggs are actually going to be Arctic and then Volcano. So I basically copy and pasted basic 3 times, and then all I really had to do was rename them. For the Earth egg, I actually changed the price and the currency, but for all the other ones, I just kept that the exact same. Now that we've created the config table, let's actually go ahead and create a brand new type. So we're going to say export type. This is going to be called egg config, and that's going to be equal to a table. Now what I mean by egg config is the information in these objects right here. So inside of basic, Earth, and all the other eggs. So inside of here, we're going to have price, which is a number. We're also going to have the currency property, which is going to be a string. And finally, we have pets, which is a table. And inside of that table, we're going to have strings with a table that has chance, which is a number, and rarity, which is a string, just like that. So you might be confused by what type this variable actually is. What this would be is actually a table with a string, and the value of that would actually be egg config. So we actually made a mistake here, which I realized only during the editing process. For some reason, I didn't have a specific setting enabled, which is now enabled by default in Roblox Studio. So you guys are probably seeing this red underline and actually have an error here. But in my video, I didn't have the error, and that's entirely my fault. Now, where I made a mistake is that I actually should have surrounded this string right here in brackets. Additionally, with the pets table, we should also surround this string in brackets as well. The reason that we're doing that is because now we're saying that this type is actually multiple strings stored inside of this specific table. Now later on in the video, you might see that my config is still the previous way. Like I said, this specific part of the video has been recorded after the editing process, so I'm making this change after the video has actually been completed. So that's the type of this table. Basically, this table contains multiple eggs, and the eggs tables are the egg config. Okay, so now that we've created that, let's actually go into our module script part of this. We're going to create a brand new function. This is going to be called getConfig, and we're going to accept an egg, which is a string, and we're going to return an egg config. Now all we're going to do is say return config, index that with a specific egg, and there we go. Below this, we're going to create another function called getEggModels. Inside of here, we're going to create a variable called models, which is going to be equal to an empty table. Now, we're going to loop through all of the descendants inside of the workspace, getDescendants. Now, the descendant's name is equal to eggStand. Then what we want to do is create a brand new variable called egg. That's going to be equal to descendants. Also, descendant should not be plural, so let's go ahead and fix that. Now, to get the egg, we want to use getAttribute on the descendant, and we want to look for the egg attribute. If we get the egg attribute, then that means that this is definitely an egg model, and we want to add that to our models variable table that we have above. So we're going to say models, and then we're going to index that with a specific egg, and we're going to set that equal to the descendant. Finally, at the end of the function, we want to return the models table. Now, this function is going to be used on both the server and the client to actually find and locate and use all of the egg models that are inside of our game. We want to create another function below this. This is going to be called getHatchChance. This is going to accept an egg, which is going to be a string, a pet, which is going to be a string, and then data, which we're not going to set the type of, but it's actually going to be the player's data. We want to create a variable called config. That's going to be equal to eggs.getConfig, pass through the egg. If we're not able to find the config, then we just want to return n, stop the function right there. We then want to create a variable called luckStat. That's going to be equal to 1. We then want to create a variable called chance. That's going to be equal to config.pets. Index that with a specific pet, and then we want to get the chance property of that. Now, if the chance is less than 10, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to multiply the chance by the player's luckStat. Finally, at the end of this function, we want to return the chance variable. Now, let me explain what we're actually going to be using this function for. Basically, in a lot of simulators, you have a game pass or other things that you can purchase for Robux, which will increase your odds of getting rare pets and eggs. Let's add a comment right here. Do Game Pass check here. So in the future, when we actually add game passes to our game, we'll add that logic inside of here where we'll check if the player has a specific game pass. And if the player does have the specific game pass, then we want to actually increase the odds of that player getting rare pets from the egg. So to further explain my logic, what I'm checking right here is if the chance of hatching the pet from the egg is less than 10%, then we're going to multiply that by the player's luck stat. So for instance, if the pet has a 5% chance of hatching and the player has a luck stat of 2, then that means that the pet then has a 10% chance of hatching. Now I almost forgot something. We want to go underneath of our module script variable, and we want to create a new variable called config, and we want to set that equal to our config variable just like that. So now that we've created both those functions, we're pretty much done inside of this module script, and now we can actually move on to adding player data. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, open up the template module script. Inside of here, we want to go ahead and get that eggs config just like that. We're then going to actually go ahead and copy this default reverse buttons and then also the for loop below it. We'll rename this to default pets_2_delete. That's going to be equal to a blank table still. Now, instead of looping through the reverse, we're actually going to be looping through the egg config. So for the key, it's going to be the egg, and then we're going to get egg info for the value in egg config.config. And then what do we want to do? Well, we want to index default pets to delete with the specific egg, and we're going to actually set that equal to a blank table. Then what we want to do is we want to loop through the pets inside of that specific egg. So pet is going to be the key, pet info is going to be the value in egg info.pets. And then what we're going to do is index the default pets to delete table with the specific egg and with the specific pet, and we're going to set that equal to false. So basically, it's going to loop through every single egg and every single pet inside of each of those eggs, setting all those values to false, and that's going to be the default data set for the player. Then what we want to do is copy this variable. We're going to go down inside of the template table, and we're going to say auto delete pets. And we're going to set that equal to the default pets to delete variable. And now we're done with the player data. What we're then going to do is go inside of the replicated storage and open up our remotes folder. Inside of here, we're going to add a brand new folder to this, and we're going to rename this to eggs. Inside of this folder, we want to add a brand new remote event that's going to be called auto delete pet, and then we want to create a remote function, which is going to be called hatch. Now we'll be using those remotes in the future. Now that we've created those remotes, let's go ahead and add those to our state. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the client folder, and open up the state module script. Inside of here, let's go down towards the bottom of the script, copy the last remote that we actually added. Instead of saying remote.pets, we're actually going to say remote.eggs.autoDeletePet. Now what we're actually going to get passed to this is the egg, which is going to be a string, the pet, which is going to be a string, and is selected, which is a boolean. And then what we want to do is we want to say player data.autoDeletePets, index that with the specific egg, index that with the specific pet, and set that equal to is selected. Now that we've created the state logic, we can start scripting the GUI. So we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the GUI folder, and add a brand new local script to this. We're going to rename this to eggs. Inside of here, we want to get most of our common variables. So we want to get the player, the replicated storage, the user input, and the run service. And then we also want to create a variable for the local player, for the player's GUI, for the remotes folder. Make sure you set that replicated storage.remotes.eggs. We can then start getting some of our configs. So we're going to need the eggs config. That's of course equal to require replicated storage.configs.eggs. We'll get the pets config as well. We also want to get the viewport model module as well. That's inside of the replicated storage.libs.viewport model. We also want to get the state manager. So inside of the client folder called state manager. We also want to get the format number module as well. So replicated storage.libs.formatNumber.simple. We're going to rename that to format number. Now let's create a variable for the GUI. That's going to be equal to player GUI, wait for child, pet egg. Now inside of that GUI, we have our billboard GUI. So let's create a variable called egg GUI. That's going to be equal to GUI.egg. And now let's start creating some variables for the frames. So for the info frame, we're saying egg GUI.info. We then have the container frame and then the buns frame as well. We'll then create a variable for the template, which is inside of the container. So container.template. And then we want to create two constant variables. The first one is going to be called clicks currency icon, and that's going to be equal to a string. And we're going to copy and paste that. And this time we want to say Robux currency icon. Now to get our clicks currency icon, we can actually go inside of the asset manager, copy the ID right there. Now for the Robux image, I'm just actually going to grab one from the toolbox, so you can decide which one you want to use. I'm going to go ahead and grab this gold one. So copy ID, paste that right there. Let's make sure that we grab that full link. There we go. Now we've got those two constant variables created. We also want to create a variable called egg models, and that's going to be equal to eggsconfig.getEggModels. And now we've got most of the basic variables that we're going to need. Now the first system that we're going to script is actually tracking which egg the player is closest to, so that we can actually display the GUI. Now the way that we're actually going to do this is by using the run service. So we're going to say run service.stepped connect, and then we want to create an anonymous function inside of here without any arguments. Now if you're unfamiliar with what the run service is, specifically the stepped event, basically the stepped event fires every frame prior to the physics simulation. Basically the event is fired off a ton, multiple times per second. Now alternatively, you could use a while loop instead of this, but recently I found myself going more so with the run service because it feels better doing that than using a while loop. Anyways, above that, what we're going to do is create a brand new function. This function is going to be called getClosestEgg. The first thing we're going to do is create a variable called character, and that's going to be the player's character. So we're going to say player.character. If we're not able to find the character, then we just want to return n and stop the function right there. We're then going to get the primary part of the character. So we're going to say character.primaryPart. If the primary part does not exist, then we just want to stop the function right there. Then what we want to do is loop through all of the egg models inside of our egg models variable. So we're going to say for egg, comma model, which is of the type model, in egg models, do. We're going to create a variable called part. That's going to be equal to model.primaryPart. And then we're going to create a variable called distance between. That's going to be equal to, now you want to surround this in parentheses. So we're going to say part.position minus primaryPart.position. And then outside of the parentheses, we're going to say dot magnitude. That's going to give us the distance between the player and the egg part. Then we want to say if distance between is less than or equal to. Now this is how far you want the player to be away from the egg for the GUI to actually appear. And I'm going to say 10. So we're going to say distance between less than or equal to 10. And if the distance is less than or equal to 10, then we're going to return that specific egg just like that. So inside of our step connection, we're going to create a variable called closest egg. That's going to be equal to the get closest egg function. We're then going to say if closest egg, then. Now right below our eggs model variable, we want to create a brand new one called selected egg. And that's not going to be equal to anything. Then back inside of our step connection, inside of this if statement, we want to say if closest egg does not equal selected egg, then, and I'm just going to put a comment here for now, display GUI. Now this variable is going to keep giving me an error until I say equals nil. So let's put that as that so we can put that error to sleep. Now if there is no closest egg, then what we actually want to do is we want to set the egg GUI.enabled to false because the player is not by any egg, so we don't want the GUI to be displayed. Now at the bottom of this, we actually want to set the selected egg equal to the closest egg variable, just like that. So multiple times per second, we're going to be looking for the closest egg to the player. If the player is in range of some egg, we're going to check if the closest egg equals the selected egg. If it does not equal that, then we're going to display the GUI. The reason we're doing this check is because if a player stands by the same egg and doesn't move, then we need this check to prevent the GUI from regenerating over and over and over again. So we only want to regenerate the GUI when a player looks at a different egg. Now the reason that we're saying else here is because if the player is not by any eggs, then we want to set the GUI to not be enabled. And then finally at the bottom of this, we're updating the selected egg variable with whatever egg the player is closest to. Now let's go ahead and create a function called display egg. That's going to accept an egg, which is a string. Inside of here, we're going to create a variable called egg model, and that's going to be equal to egg models, and we're going to index that with the specific egg. Now that we have the specific model, we want to set the adorning property of our egg GUI to that model. So we're going to say egg GUI.adorning equals egg model. Then we want to enable that GUI as well. Then we want to create a variable called egg config. This is going to be equal to eggsconfig.getConfig and pass through the specific egg. We also want to create a variable called currency. That's going to be equal to eggconfig.currency. We then want to update the info. Inside of the info frame, we have an egg frame, and inside of that egg frame, we have an egg text label. We want to set the text of that to the egg space egg. So it'll say something like basic egg, forest egg, arctic egg, volcano egg, and so on. Now right next to that egg frame, we also have a price frame, and inside of there we have a price text label. Now we're going to use format number.formatCompact on eggconfig.price. And then we also want to update the prices icon. So inside of the info frame, inside of the price frame, inside of the icon image label, we want to set the image of this. If the currency equals Robux, then we want to use the Robux currency icon. Otherwise, we want to use the clicks currency icon. Now that we've updated the egg text label, the price text label, and the icon image, we want to start generating all the pets inside of the container. But before we generate all the pets inside of the container, we also have to think ahead, and we actually want to clear all the previous pets out of the container. So what we want to do is loop through all the children inside of the container. So container get children. Now, if the child is a GUI button and the child is visible, then we want to destroy it. And these two checks are to guarantee that is one of our template buttons. So now that we've cleared out the container frame, we now want to generate the pets. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all the pets inside of the egg config. So we're going to say for pet, pet info in egg config.pets. And now we're actually going to generate a pet. But let me put a comment right here because we're going to come back to that. Now we're pretty much done with this function, but let's go ahead and actually call it. And where do we want to call it? Right here where we left the comment display GUI. So we're going to say display egg and pass through the closest egg, just like that. Now above the display egg function, let's go ahead and create another function. This is going to be called generate pet. We're going to accept the egg, which is going to be a string, as well as the pet, which is going to be a string as well. Let's go ahead and create a variable called egg config. That's of course going to be equal to eggsconfig.getConfig, pass through the egg. We also want to create a variable called template. That's going to be equal to template clone. We want to set the name of this template to the pet. We also want to set the parent of this template to the container. We'll then create a variable called chance. That's of course going to be equal to eggsconfig.getHatchChance. We want to pass through the egg, the pet, and the state manager.getData. We're then going to update the chance text label inside of the template. So we're going to say chance.text equals chance.%. And we also want to update the rarity text label as well. And that's going to be equal to eggconfig.pets, index that with the specific pet, and then say .rarity. So we've just updated the chance and the rarity text labels. We now need to decide if the selected text label should be shown or not. So we're going to create a variable called selected. That's going to be equal to template find first child, and then we're going to look for the selected text label. The reason we have to do this is because if we say template.selected, selected is actually a property of text labels. So when we try to say .selected, it goes directly to the property rather than going to the text label that we created. So that's why we have to use find first child. Now that we found it, we're going to say selected.visible, and we're going to set that to the state manager.getData.autoDelete pets, index that with a specific egg, and index that with a specific pet. Then we're going to create a variable called model, and that's going to be equal to the actual pet's model. So replicate storage.pets, find first child, pet, and then we want to clone that. Then using the viewport model module, we're going to call generate viewport. We're going to pass the template.viewport viewport frame, the model, and then cframe.angles, 0, math.rad, -90, comma 0, just like that. The reason that we're including these C-frame angles is because we want to set the pet's orientation to face the camera. So now we just did the work for the viewport frame. Let's also set the layout order of the template. Usually the most common pets are displayed towards the top or at the beginning, and the most rare ones are displayed towards the bottom or towards the right. So we're going to say layout order equals minus chance. So basically the higher the chance is, the more negative the number will be, meaning that those will be displayed first. Let's then also make sure that we actually set the visibility of this equal to true as well. And then finally, when we click on these buttons, so we're going to say mouse button 1 click, connect function, we want to actually do something. And what we actually want to do is we want to fire that auto delete pet remote event that we created earlier. So we're going to say fire server, and we want to pass through the egg and the pet. So whenever we click on a pet inside of this GUI, we want to tell the server, hey, we want to auto delete, or we want to cancel auto deleting this specific pet inside of this specific egg. Now that we've created that generate pet function, we can actually call it right where we had this generate pet comment at. So we're going to say generate pet, we're going to pass through the egg, and we're going to pass through the pet. Now something that we have to think about is, remember how I said whenever we click a pet, that will toggle if it should be auto deleted or not? Well, we want to create a function above our generate pet function, which is actually called update pet. And the only argument that this is going to accept is called pet, and that's going to be a string. Now we're going to create a variable called template, and that's going to be equal to container, find first child, and we're going to look for that pet inside of the container. If we're not able to find it, then we just want to stop the function right here. If we're able to find it, then we want to update the chance text label, and we basically want to update it the exact same way that we had down here. So let's actually just copy and paste this. And then we also want to update the selected label as well. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this as well. Now for the egg variable, rather than saying egg, we're actually going to say selected egg for both of these. And now that function is pretty much done. Like I said, we're going to be using this function anytime we actually toggle what pet we want to be auto deleted. Now we actually have to call this function. So let's go towards the bottom of our script. At the very bottom, we want to say remotes.autoDeletePet.onClientEvent connect, and we're going to create an anonymous function. Now this anonymous function is going to accept an egg as a string, a pet as a string, and is selected as a boolean. Even though we're not really going to use that, we'll still include it. What we then want to do is we want to actually check if the egg equals the selected egg. Now if the egg does equal the selected egg, then we're going to say task.delay 0, create an anonymous function, and then we're going to call the update pet function, and we're going to pass through the pet. The reason that we use task.delay is because of how our client store works, and that's where we're pulling all of our data from, but you probably know that already if you watch the State Manager episode. Now we're almost done on the client side. All we have left is the actual hatching system. So above our get closest egg function, we're going to create a brand new one. This is simply going to be called hatch. Now inside of here, we want to check if the selected egg is set. If it's not, then we just want to return end. We're going to create a variable called eggConfig. That's of course going to be equal to eggsconfig.getConfig and pass through the selected egg. We'll then create a variable called is triple hatch. That's going to be equal to false. We'll then create a variable called is 6 hatch. That will also be equal to false. And then we're going to create a variable called amount of hatches. That's going to be equal to 1. We're then going to create a variable called stored pets. That's going to be equal to petsconfig.get total stored pets. And we want to pass through the state manager.get data. Then we're going to copy and paste that variable. Instead of stored pets, we want to say max stored pets. That's going to be equal to get max stored pets, passing through the state manager.get data. We'll then create a variable called has storage. That's going to be equal to the stored pets plus amount of hatches. And if that's less than or equal to max stored pets. Now, if we don't have any storage, then we just want to return end and stop the function right there. We're then going to create a variable called price. That's going to be equal to eggconfig.price times the amount of hatches. We're also going to create a variable called currency. That's going to be equal to eggconfig currency. Now, if the currency equals Robux, then we want to do something specifically. We're not going to script this in right now. I'm going to leave a comment right here that says add dev product because we're not going to actually create that system yet. But when we create that system, we'll come back to here and we'll add a pet as a dev product. Inside of here, though, we want to say else. So if the currency does not equal Robux, then we want to create a variable called money. That's going to be equal to state manager.get data and index that with the specific currency. Now, the thought here is that currency is either going to equal something like clicks or rebursts. So we should be able to index the get data with that specific currency and actually get the value of that. After that, we're going to create a variable called can afford. That's going to be equal to money is greater than price. Now, if we're not able to afford it, then we just want to stop the function right there. After that, we're going to create a variable called pets. That's going to be equal to remotes. We're then going to use the hatch remote function. We're going to call invoke server, and we're going to pass through the specific egg that we want to hatch. Now, if we do get pets, then what do we want to do? Well, we're going to just print hatched for right now, and then we're actually going to print the pets that we've hatched. So just to recap on this function, if we don't have any eggs selected, then then this function will have an error if we let this go through. That's why we're checking this off the start. After we verify if we have an egg selected, we're then creating variables for triple hatch and sixth hatch. And we haven't implemented this logic yet. We might do this in a separate video or maybe towards the end of this video, but we would use this logic and actually modify the amount of hatches based on that logic. After that, we're checking the player's stored pets compared to the max stored pets. And if the player is able to store the amount of pets that they want to hatch, then they are able to continue. After that, we're going to go ahead and check the price. Now it gets a little bit more complex here because we have a couple of different currencies. We could have Robux, we could have clicks, or we could have rebirths. So for Robux, we need to do something very specific, and that would actually be prompt the player to purchase something, but we're not going to implement that during this episode. Alternatively, if it's just money or rebirths or something like that, it's pretty simple. We're going to check how much money they have, then we're going to check if they can afford it, and if they can afford it, we're going to go ahead and invoke that remote function, and then try to actually hatch, and tell the server that we want to hatch a specific egg. Now that we have the function created, we actually want to think about when we want to call this function. So what we want to do above our run service connection is we actually want to say buttons.1, and we want to listen for when this button is clicked. And then when this button is clicked, we want to call the hatch function. Additionally, using the user input service, we want to listen for the input ended. And we're going to connect that to an anonymous function, which accepts the input and processed. Now, if we don't have any selected egg or process is true, then we want to return end and stop the function right there. Alternatively, if the input.keycode equals enum.keycode.e, then we're going to call the hatch function. So if a player presses the E key, then we're going to call the hatch function. Of course, you could set the key code to whatever hotkey you actually want to use, but now we have that hooked up to if the player clicks the button or actually uses the hotkey, that's how we're able to hatch the egg. Now, we're pretty much done on the client side, so we can go ahead, move over to the server side, and start scripting on there. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, and we're going to add a brand new script to this. Now we're going to rename this script to eggs, and of course, inside of this script, we want to have a bunch of our basic variables. So we want the replicated, the server script, and the player service. We also want the remotes variable, the eggs config variable, and the player data manager as well. On top of that, we also want the format number module that's inside of the replicated storage .libs.formatNumber.simple. We also want the pets config. So pets and pets. And now we also need the pets manager as well. So inside of the server script service, we have the module script called pets, and we're just going to call this variable pets manager, just like that. Now we also want two constant variables inside of here. We're actually going to grab those from our local script. Could have honestly put these inside of the eggs config module script, but whatever. We'll just copy and paste them for here too. The first thing that we're going to do is create a function. This is going to be called update egg models. And what we're actually wanting to update here is the price display. So that's what we're going to be updating for each of the eggs. Inside of this function, we're going to create a variable called egg models. That's going to be equal to eggsconfig.get egg models. And then we want to loop through all of them. So the key is going to be egg, value is going to be model, which is a type of model, and that's inside of our egg models variable. Inside of here, we're going to create a variable called config. That's going to be equal to eggsconfig.getConfig, pass through the specific egg. We're then going to create a variable called currency. That's of course going to be equal to config.currency, and price, which is going to be equal to config.price. Below that, inside of the model, we go inside of the price part, inside of the other price part, and then we have the service GUI there. Inside of the service GUI, we have a text label called price, and we want to set the text of that to format number, format compact, price. Now we're going to copy and paste this, and right here, instead of modifying the price text label, we actually want to modify the image of the icon image label. Now how we're going to set this is based off if the currency equals Robux. And if it does equal Robux, then we want to use the Robux currency icon. Otherwise, we want to use the clicks currency icon. So that'll update all of the egg models that are actually in our game. And let's go to the bottom of our script and actually call that function. Let's then create a new function called auto delete pet. That's going to accept a player as a player, an egg as a string, and a pet as a string. Now, we want to get the player's profile. So we're going to say profile equals player data dot profiles, index that with a specific player. If we're not able to find the profile, then we just want to return end, stop the function right there. Otherwise, we want to create a variable called egg state. That's going to be equal to profile dot data dot auto delete pets. And then we want to index that with a specific egg. Now, if we're not able to find that egg state, then we want to return end and stop the function right there. Then we're going to create a variable called pet state. That's going to be equal to egg state and index that with the specific pet. Now, if pet state equals nil, then we just want to return end and stop the function right there. The reason that we're doing this is because we're going to call this function based on a remote event. So players can sometimes manipulate the egg or the pet argument that they actually pass to us from the client, and they could give us a completely incorrect egg that doesn't actually exist. That's why we have to check if this variable exists right here. And the same with this. They could give us a different pet that's not actually inside of this specific egg. So we have to check if that equals nil before we can actually believe that that variable is true. Now, after that, we're actually going to go ahead and update the player's data. So we're going to say profile.data.auto delete pets, index that with the specific egg, index that with the specific pet, and we're going to set that equal to not pet state. And then we want to replicate this to the player as well. So we're going to say remotes.auto delete pet, fire client, pass through the player, pass through the egg, pass through the pet, and pass through not pet state. Now that function is finished, let's go ahead and actually call this. So let's go towards the bottom of our script. We're going to say remotes.autodeletePet.onServerEvent connect, and we're going to connect that to the autoDeletePet function. Now that we've connected that function, let's go ahead and create the hatch function. So we're going to say local function hatch. That's going to take a player and an egg. Now with this function, we of course want to get the player's profile. So let's go ahead and grab that. After that, we want to create a variable called onCooldown, and we want to go underneath of our constants, and we want to create a brand new variable called hatch cooldown, which is going to be equal to a table. Now back inside of our hatch function for the onCooldown variable, we want to set that equal to the hatch cooldown and index that with a specific player. Now if the player is on cooldown, then we just want to stop the function right there. We then want to create a variable called eggConfig. Of course, that's going to be equal to eggConfig.getConfig, pass through the egg. If we're not able to find that eggConfig, then return n, stop the function right there. We'll then create a variable called amount of hatches. That's going to be equal to 1. Honestly, we can just go back and forth in between our two scripts right here. So just copy all of these variables pretty much because you're doing the same thing on both the server and the client. So paste them just like that. So is triple hatch, is 6 hatch, amount of hatches, stored pets. Instead of saying the state manager.getData, we want to use the profile.data. So we'll pass through that, and then we want to pass through that right here as well. There we go. Now instead of saying is triple hatch, we want to say has triple hatch and has 6 hatch. And then we'll also create variables to see if the player has these enabled when we actually implement the system. So for example, if has triple hatch, then amount of hatches equals 3. And you could do the same thing for the 6 hatch as well, but we're not going to be setting that up in this video. Anyways, after we do that, we can then calculate the price. So we're going to create a variable called price. That's going to be equal to eggConfig.price, multiply that by the amount of hatches. Then we're going to create a variable called currency. That's going to be equal to eggConfig.currency. Now, if the currency does not equal Robux, then we're going to create a variable called money. That's going to be equal to the profile.data. Index that with the currency. We'll create a variable called can afford. That's going to be equal to money is greater than price. If the player cannot afford it, then we just want to return n and stop the function right there. Now, of course, if the currency is Robux, then we want to do something entirely separately, but we're not adding that system in here yet. After that, we want to check if the player is able to store the amount of pets that they want to hatch. Now that we've gone through all those sanity checks, we can actually hatch the egg for the player. So let's go ahead and throw them on cooldown. We're going to say hatch cooldown, index that with the player, and we're going to set that equal to true. We're going to say task.delay, and let's say whatever our cooldown is that we want to use, we'll say 5 seconds for the cooldown. We're going to create an anonymous function inside of here, and then we're going to say hatch cooldown, index that with the player, equals nil. After that, we're going to create a variable called pets. That's going to be equal to a table. Then we want to use a while loop, and we're going to go through the amount of hatches that we have. So we're going to say while amount of hatches is greater than 0, do. The first thing that we want to do is subtract 1 from the amount of hatches. Then we want to take these variables that we have right here, put them inside of here. The reason that we're checking every single time is something weird could possibly happen where the player is given a pet in the middle of this while loop running. I think the likeliness of it is practically impossible, but the possibility is there. So that's why we're checking this every single time. Instead of returning nothing here, we want to actually return pets. Now, after doing that check, we actually want to take the player's money. So if currency equals clicks, then player data dot adjust clicks player and minus eggConfig dot price. Now we can copy and say else if currency equals rebirths, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to adjust the player's rebirths. So there we go. I messed my else if statement up there, but I just fixed it, so now we're all good. After we take the player's money, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called pet. Now we can't actually set this variable yet because we have to create a function above here. So let's go ahead and do that. This function is going to be called choose pet, which is going to accept an egg, which is a string, and the player's data, which we're not going to set the type of. Now, for creating this function inside of here, we want to create a variable called eggConfig. That's, of course, going to be equal to the same variable. So let's just copy and paste that just like that. After that, we're going to create a variable called total weight. That's going to be equal to 0. After that, we want to loop through all the pets inside of that egg. So we're going to say pet props in eggConfig.pets do. And then to total weight, we want to add the props.chance. So we want to add the chance of the pet to the total weight. After that, we're going to create a variable called chance. That's going to be equal to math.random. And we want a number between 1 and total weight. Then we're going to create a variable called count. That's going to be equal to 0. And then we once again want to loop through all the pets again. So we're going to copy and paste that. Inside of this loop, we want to create a variable called hatch chance. That's going to be equal to eggsconfig.getHatchChance. Pass through the egg, pass through the pet, and pass through the player data. Then to the count variable, we can add the hatch chance to that. After that, we want to check if the chance is less than or equal to the counter. If it is, then we're going to return pet. So now this function will randomly pick one of the pets, taking into account the chance that we set for them, and then return a random pet from that egg. Now that we've created that function, we can go back down into our hatch function, and for this pet variable, we're going to set that equal to choose pet. We're going to pass through the egg and the profile.data. Now, once we get the pet, we want to create a variable called auto-delete because we want to check if this pet should be auto-deleted. So we're going to say profile.data.auto-delete pets, index that with a specific egg, and index that with the specific pet. Now, if we're not supposed to auto delete that pet, then let's actually give the pet to the player. So let's go ahead and grab its rarity. That's going to be equal to eggconfig.pets, index that with the specific pet, and then grab the rarity. Then we can go ahead and create a pet instance. And how we're going to do that is by using the pet manager. We're going to use the create pet method, and we're going to pass through the pet. Now we actually need to update this function, but we'll do that in a minute. Now that we've gotten the pet instance, let's go ahead and give the pet to the player. So we're going to use the pets manager once again. We're going to call the give pet function. We're going to pass through the player, and we're going to pass through the pet instance. Now that we've actually given the player the pet, let's make sure that we insert that pet into our pets table. And then finally, at the end of this function, we're going to return that pets table to the client. So now we're done with all of the hatching logic. All of this is good to go, but real quick, I want to update this create pet function inside of the pets module script on the server side. So we're going to add an extra argument to this function. It's going to be called rarity, and it's going to be a string, but it's not necessary. So that's why we're adding a question mark to the end of the type. Now for the rarity field that we have right here, or the property, whatever you want to call it, we're going to say if rarity, then rarity. Otherwise, we're going to set it to common by default. Now that we've done that, we can go back into our server script right here. And when we pass through the pet, we can also pass through the rarity as well. And now that we've done that, this is completed. I swear, the mistakes I make are some of the most dumbest ones. It's not run service.step. It's actually step. I believe I made that issue when I was trying to read the description of what step actually is to you guys. But anyway, now that we fixed that, we should be good to go. Now I actually got slightly ahead of myself. I forgot to hook up the remote function to the function that we just created. So let's say remote.hatch .onServerInvoke equals hatch, just like that. Also in the editing process, we discovered another issue. And using this method, the first time that you actually go to an egg and all the pets are generated, for an odd reason, the viewport model might not actually be able to accurately generate the viewport frame, and the pet model might not be displayed inside of the viewport frame. So how can we fix this? Well, all we have to do is say task.delay, give it a delay of 0.01, create an anonymous function inside of here, and then we're going to generate the viewport frame. Now you might be thinking, if we're using a task.delay, is that going to cause any issues, or are players going to be able to tell that there is a delay? Nobody's going to be able to visually see any sort of delay when it comes down to 0.01 seconds. Now we can start this up and test it out. Once we get into the game, we can look at the price labels on both of our eggs, and we can see that the icons have been updated as well as the price. If we go over to the eggs, we can actually see the GUI is appearing. We can also see that the info frame on the left is being updated as well for each of the specific eggs and how much they cost. We can see that the pets are updating as well. If we click on a pet, we can see that it has an X over top of it. We can toggle this on and off, and the data is persistent, so that's looking great. Additionally, we can click on this button to hatch a pet, and we can see that we did hatch something. We actually got a cat pet. So if we look inside of our pets, we can see that we have 4 pets right now. Let's go ahead and hatch again. We just got a cat pet once again, and we can see that that's been added to our inventory. Now we got an error when we just got a dog pet. The reason for that is because we haven't actually set up the dog pet in the pet config module. So as long as you guys set up all the pets inside of your pet's config, you don't have to worry about this error at all. It's not related to anything we worked on today. So anyway, I can keep hatching this, and we can see that we're getting more and more pets, which is looking great. We're also on cooldown, so we can only hatch them like once every 5 seconds. We saw that clicking E works. Let's see if we press this button, and we can see that by pressing this button, that is also working as well. Let's look at all the pets that we have. So currently we have 9 pets. Now let's go ahead and hatch a pet. We can see that every single time we're hatching a pet now, nothing is actually added into our inventory. It's still staying at 9 out of 100. So we know that the auto delete is working perfectly. In the next episode, we'll get around to actually adding a hatching animation, and we'll probably get to some of the other hatching buttons and modes as well. With all that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you guys did enjoy or this video did help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified whenever I upload more Roblox from my content. I also have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and get access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys go and check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.